Individual view and will not affect anyone else or what the public sees. The hearing so you can see the timer, witnesses, and your fellow members. Please note that the timer is its own square and will only be visible if you are in gallery review. It will remain there throughout the event. All participants are automatically muted upon entry to the hearing. In a moment, I will mute any individuals and participants who have taken themselves off mute. All participants are asked to keep themselves muted when not actively engaging in the discussion, which should help limit echoes or other disruptions. In instances in which members yield back or otherwise conclude their turn speaking, but do not remember to remute themselves, I will do so to limit inadvertent background.
This hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on ensuring women can thrive in a post-pandemic economy. At the outset, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, so ordered. Now, before I welcome our witnesses, I will go over a few housekeeping matters. Today, the committee is holding a hybrid hearing. Members and witnesses may participate remotely or in person. For individuals participating remotely, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute a participant's microphone when the participant is not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. If you are participating remotely and are experiencing connectivity issues, please contact staff immediately so those issues can be resolved. Members participating in the hearing room or on the remote platform are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If you are participating remotely and I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute your microphone under any other conditions. Would like to remind members participating remotely in this proceeding to keep your camera on at all times, even if you are not under recognition by the chair. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. If you are on the remote platform and choose to participate in a different proceeding, please turn your camera off. Finally, we have established an email box for submitting documents before and during committee proceedings, and we have distributed that email address to your staff. Now I will introduce our witnesses. This morning, we will be hearing from Dr. Stefania Albanesi, Professor of Economics at the University of Pittsburgh, Ms. Ajin Poo, the Executive Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. I see that D and I go for it. Ms. Rosa Walker, a mother and MomsRising member, and Mrs. Carrie Lukas, the President of the Independent Women's Forum. We welcome all of you. I now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Every March, we celebrate Women's History Month to honor the vital role of women and girls in our nation's history. From revolutionaries, abolitionists, and suffragists to labor leaders, equal rights activists, and elected officials, women have always been on the front lines in the fight for progress. Generations of women have struggled and sacrificed to build a better country for the next generation of trailblazers to inherit. But despite the progress made and battles won, women, especially women of color, still face systematic barriers to opportunity. The COVID-19 pandemic and resulting recession raised these barriers even higher, worsening underlying inequities and disparities that have pushed women out of the labor force, compounded their caregiving responsibilities, and more. Last week marked 1 year since the American Rescue Plan was signed into law and Democrats delivered life-saving and life-changing relief for working families, small businesses, and communities across the country. Since President Biden took office, we've added a record-breaking 7.4 million jobs back to our economy. But when you look below the surface, it's not hard to see the challenges women are still facing. Since the beginning of the pandemic, women have been pushed out of the workforce at a shocking rate, losing 12.2 million jobs at the depth of the recession. Women accounted for 52% of jobs lost at the peak of the crisis, despite making up only 47% of the labor force at that time. Sectors in which women are overly represented, like education, health services, leisure, and hospitality, saw the greatest job loss to date and have been the slowest to recover. Because women typically bear the brunt of childcare and caring for family members, as businesses shuttered, schools closed, and working from home became the norm for many, it was women, especially women of color, who found themselves laid off or forced to make the impossible choice between caring for their families or providing for them. Without childcare, in-person schooling, or paid leave, the burden of this crisis fell disproportionately on the shoulders of women. Women also constitute the majority of our frontline workers. So even if they did not lose their jobs, these women faced increased health risks, fewer opportunities for remote work, and a lack of paid leave. Again, there is a disproportionate impact on women of color. Black women are more likely to be the sole earners for their families, meaning that they may be forced to take lower wage jobs or more dangerous work to make ends meet for their families. Today, 2 years later, we have made tremendous economic progress, but we simply aren't there yet when it comes to women in the workforce. When compared to February 2020 levels, there are currently 1.2 million women missing from the labor force. In contrast, the number of men in the labor force is above pre-pandemic levels. And not all groups have been impacted equally. The unemployment rate for white women is 3.1%, for Latina women it's 4.8%, and for Black women it's 6.1%. Our economy cannot afford to permanently lose 1.2 million workers, and women should not be forced to stay out of the workforce because we have failed to respond to very obvious unmet needs in our country. Congress must address these issues, or we will be left with a partial recovery, diminished productivity, and curbed economic growth for decades to come. We have to lower the cost of childcare and extend the child tax credit expansion. Establishing universal pre-K for all 3- and 4-year-olds is essential. U.S. workers, particularly women, need paid leave, and they certainly need and deserve equal pay. These are the types of investments that will make it possible for more women to return to the workforce. They will help business owners fill open positions and grow, and they will ensure we recover from the pandemic stronger than before, have a more fair and equitable economy, and build an America that better reflects our values. That is what we are focusing on today at this hearing, and that will remain a top priority of this Congress until we get it done. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Smith, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is fair to say the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women. It is also important to acknowledge that much of that negative impact came in the form of policies enacted in response to the pandemic. For example, working mothers represent 27% of Americans who left the workforce during the pandemic. And school closures played a huge part. According to a 2020 study, mothers were almost 70% less likely to be working in states that closed schools early compared to other states. In other words, school closures harm both the child and the parent. It was under the guise of responding to COVID-19 that just over a year ago, Democrats chose to spend $2 trillion, and less than 9% of which went to combating and eliminating the virus. They ignored the warnings, including from those in their own party, that the spending spree would only ignite inflation. We now have the highest spike in prices in 40 years. The most recent data from February showing a year-to-year increase of 7.9%, the highest in 40 years. Prices are up on everything from groceries to gas to the clothes that you put on your back. The cost of women's apparel is up 11%, and mothers are having to shell out more and more money for infant and toddler clothing too, with the prices rising by nearly 9%. If Democrats want to help women, if they want to help women thrive in a post-pandemic economy, they ought to stop the inflationary spending that is undermining paychecks in family budgets. When it comes to jobs, Democrat policymakers are also keeping women out of their workforce. Right now, 80% of the top 10 states with the highest unemployment rates for women are run by Democrat governors. Of the 15 states with the lowest unemployment rate for women, 11 are run by Republican. 11 out of 15 are run by Republican governors. That is no coincidence. Democrats will claim that the policies in their $5 trillion Build Back Broke bill will solve these challenges, just as they claim spending another $5 trillion will solve a spending-driven inflation crisis. Democrats are trying to reframe and rename their agenda to fit the moment rather than change the agenda to fix the challenges in the moment. Their spending policies will further drive up prices. Their policies will reduce incentives to work and make childcare for many mothers more expensive. In fact, a Congressional Budget Office analysis from November found that the Build Back Broke government-mandated childcare policies would raise costs for those middle-class families whose care is not subsidized. Those working mothers who are just above the income threshold to qualify for subsidized childcare would be forced to make a choice, work less to qualify, or pay more out of pocket for childcare. To create an economic environment under which all Americans, but particularly women, can find greater opportunity to thrive, we need to only look to the recent past. Under the economic policies of Donald Trump, which included regulatory relief and tax relief that put money back in the pockets of working families and spurred substantial growth in our economy, the labor force participation rate for women reached 57.9%, the highest since 2011. For mothers, that labor force participation rate was even higher at 72.4%, the highest since 2000. Median real earnings for women grew by 9.6% during the Trump administration, and that's including the year 2020. That wage growth was also 2 percentage points higher than wage growth for men. Under President Biden's economic policies, earnings for women have gone down by 2.6%. The decline for men has been less than still 1.2%. We ought to be disturbed by the negative impact your policies, Democrat policies, are having on all Americans. But since our colleagues often wish to make comparisons, let's be clear. Under President Trump, earnings for women grew substantially and more so than earnings for men. Under President Biden, wage growth for women has declined and declined more so than for men. The data does not lie. It tells a clear story about how damaging lockdown policies and a Washington knows best spending agenda have been and will be for women. To help women thrive in a post-pandemic economy, Washington needs to stop with the permanent pandemic narrative, stop undermining wages with inflationary spending, and stop telling Americans, particularly women, how to raise their kids. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the ranking member for his opening remarks. And we'll note that I gave you 40 seconds extra time just for the log we're keeping. In the interest of time, I ask that any other members who wish to make a statement submit their written statements for the record to the email inbox we established for receiving documents before and during the committee proceedings. Again, we've distributed that email address to your staff. I will hold the record open until the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not yet have prepared written statements. Once again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. You each will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. And I will now yield to Dr. Albanesi. You may unmute your microphone and begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. The COVID-19 pandemic has upended our lives and disrupted the economy in many ways. One reason it has been hard to grapple with the impact of the resulting recession is its unique nature. Economic downturns in the United States are usually associated with larger employment drop for men than for women. But during the COVID-19 recession, employment losses were larger for women. There are labor demand and labor supply reasons for the gender differences in typical recessions. On the demand side, the asymmetry is partly explained by gender differences in the occupation distribution, with men primarily employed in production occupations and women concentrated in services, which tend to be less cyclical. During the pandemic, however, there was a large drop in the demand for services, hitting women with the corresponding employment losses. More specifically, employment fell most in inflexible occupations in which remote work was not possible. These can be further divided into high-contact occupations that entail close contact with coworkers or customers, and low-contact occupations that do not. Women are overrepresented in inflexible high-contact occupations that primarily comprise personal service and healthcare jobs. Employment in these occupations dropped by more than 35% when the pandemic started and was still more than 10% below pre-pandemic in December 2021. Inflexible low-contact occupations, mainly comprising production, construction, transportation, and farming, exhibited a decline in employment of approximately 30% at the onset of the pandemic. But the job losses for women nearly were twice as large as those for men. And employment in these occupations was still approximately 5% lower than pre-pandemic in December 2021. On the labor supply side, married women tend to increase their attachment to the labor force during standard recessions as a form of family-level insurance against the risk of job loss by their husbands. This mechanism acts as an automatic stabilizer, and as the share of women in the labor force grew in the 70s and 80s, it actually mitigated the aggregate effects of recessions in the States. By contrast, during the pandemic, increased childcare need led some mothers to exit the labor force. So why did mothers, more than fathers, respond to the increased childcare needs by reducing labor supply? Gender norms possibly played a role, but from an economic perspective, this was likely driven by the differences in the opportunity cost of time, measured by wages. In the United States, there is a substantial child penalty that reduces wages for women when they become mothers. 3 years after having their first child, the child penalty is about 40%, and it accounts for 2/3 of the overall gender wage gap in the last decade. Given this penalty, most working mothers at the start of the pandemic were likely to be earning less than their partners, leading them to reduce labor supply. There are also large racial disparities in the employment impact of COVID-19. During the course of 2020, employment dropped by 5 to 10 percentage points more for Asian, Black, and Hispanic women than for white women. In 2021, Asian and white women showed similar employment recovery, but Black and Hispanic women lagged behind, likely because they are overrepresented in those inflexible occupations that cannot be performed remotely. Communities of color were also disproportionately exposed to COVID-19, which reduced their ability to work due to illness or the need to care for sick family members. The decline in women's employment during the pandemic has raised concern that the setback for women may be long-lasting. In the aftermath of recent recessions, a switch to automation during the recovery slowed the pickup in employment. This pattern may well repeat, since more than 30% of jobs in the occupations most affected by the pandemic are highly susceptible to automation. When it comes to labor supply, women's labor force participation has stagnated in the United States since at least the mid-90s, after several decades of rapid growth. In 1990, the United States ranked 5th out of 23 comparable countries in women's participation. By 2019, our rank had dropped to 21st. While there are maybe many factors that contributed to the United States falling behind, the economic research clearly points to family policies as the most important driver. 3 policies in particular stand out: entitlements to paid parental leave, entitlements to flexible work schedules, and publicly provided childcare. The expansion of women's labor force participation in the post-war period boosted aggregate economic performance in the United States, increasing productivity and the standard of living for all. This important engine of economic growth has stagnated in the last 30 years. Fortunately, we have a number of policy levers that are available to support women's work. I welcome further discussion of this important issue during today's hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for your testimony. I now recognize Ms. Pooh for 5 minutes. Unmute your microphone, please, and begin.
Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. It's been 2 years since we began to experience the biggest disruption to the way we live, work, and care in America. The devastating, unprecedented loss of life and livelihoods from COVID-19, And thanks to the extraordinary action and leadership on the part of Congress, we were able to prevent more catastrophe and stabilize our economy, rebuild a sense of hope for the future. So let me begin by thanking you for your extraordinary leadership. One of the reasons why we have hope is because COVID revealed both longstanding inequities that we must address and how important the role of government is in enabling our success. From where I sit, the urgency of ongoing investments in our care infrastructure cannot be overstated. COVID revealed our crumbling caregiving systems that have relied too heavily on the individual sacrifices of women in our families and a care workforce of women and women of color who are forced to live in poverty and precarity in order to stay in their jobs. One of our members from Houston, Kiana, worked as a home care worker for more than 20 years. She's also mother to a university graduate and 2 elementary school-aged children. When her mother became ill, Kiana took on caring for her. During the pandemic, Kiana lost consistent work and experienced homelessness with her 2 small children. Last summer, she took on a job for $10 per hour as a cleaner because she couldn't afford childcare and she would be able to bring her children with her while she cleaned. Domestic workers like Kiana are overwhelmingly women and majority women of color. The typical domestic worker is paid about $12 per hour, which is 39.8% less than a typical non-domestic worker. There is no paid family and medical leave, and 82% of domestic workers don't have a single paid sick day. In a survey of domestic workers from just last month, nearly 7 in 10 respondents said they are caring for their own children, and 3 in 10 are caring for sick, aging, or disabled family members. 79% told us that it had been difficult to find access to care. 8 out of 10 reported having to reduce their work hours or leave a job because of caregiving responsibilities. This is the reality for the workforce who is at the heart of our care infrastructure. Meanwhile, there are 50 million working family caregivers who need home and community-based services for their aging or disabled loved ones. Many are in the sandwich generation who also need access to childcare in order to return to work. We are an aging nation. Every year, 4 million of us will turn 65, and we're all living longer. We're also giving birth to 4 million babies per year. Due to the demand, care jobs are going to become a large share of the jobs of the future. They're also jobs that can't be outsourced or automated. They are job-enabling jobs. Let's make them good jobs. By passing the Better Care, Better Jobs Act, led by Congresswoman Debbie Dingell and Senator Bob Casey, we can meet the outsized demand for home care and create high-quality jobs to address home care worker shortages. Renewal of policies from the American Rescue Plan, such as the child tax credit, child care subsidies, and emergency paid leave, would help domestic workers better support their families. And in passing the National Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, led by Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal and Senators Kirsten Gillibrand and Ben Ray Lujan, we can establish long overdue rights and protections for this incredibly important, essential workforce. As members of this committee have often reminded us, budgets are a statement of values. In our country, we've never fully valued or supported the work of care. Now is the time. And when we do, we will all benefit, especially women and women of color. I'm truly honored to be able to testify before this committee today and look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pooh, for your testimony. I now recognize Ms. Walker for 5 minutes. Unmute your microphone, please, and begin when you're ready.
Good morning, Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. My name is Rosa Walker, and I live in Oregon City. I'm an occupational therapist working in special education, and I'm a mom of 3 incredible children. Matias, age 11, Tomas, age 8, and Gabriel Ilan, age 4. I'm also a proud member of MomsRising. Like so many families across the country, the pandemic has taken a terrible toll on my family's physical and mental health and on our financial security. We're struggling because our country hasn't invested in basic programs such as paid family and medical leave, home care, and high quality, affordable childcare. I'm here today to urge you to create a care infrastructure that provides meaningful support to families so we can recover from the pandemic and move forward. Thanks for the chance to share my story today. At the beginning of 2020, both my husband and I were working full-time. My husband is the foreman of a roofing company, and I as a learning specialist in early education. All three of our children were thriving in school, our two eldest in 3rd and 1st grade, and our youngest at a local small preschool, which we loved, even though the high cost strained our budget. When COVID hit, our lives changed overnight. Our preschool closed, our older children suddenly switched to remote learning. And like so many parents across this country, my husband and I scrambled to teach and care for our kids at home, while also working enough to keep food on the table and pay our mortgage. Then, despite efforts to stay safe, our entire family contracted COVID. While our boys recovered quickly, both my husband and I took much longer. Today, I'm still experiencing long COVID. I use an inhaler now, and I also have an autoimmune condition. Both my husband and I reduced our work schedule, often up to 50% for more than a year. Not only do we need to care for and support our children in virtual learning, we also needed to recover from long COVID. Even with a lack of paid leave, we had to do what was best for our children, and we couldn't afford to get even sicker. During this time, my husband also fell and broke a rib while working, adding still more stress. Virtual learning was a struggle that first year of the pandemic, despite both our teachers' incredible efforts and those of our own. We also began to see our children struggle with their mental health for the first time, although we worked so hard to find safe ways for them to socialize. We were fortunate to find at least some counseling in the middle of this youth mental health crisis, but this vital care costs money too. With less money coming in, our debt mounted quickly. We went from living modestly on 2 incomes to putting basics like food and medical bills on credit cards. Today, we have $11,000 in credit card debt, which would have been unthinkable before COVID. Despite all of the financial pressures on our family prior to the pandemic, student loans, housing costs, we have always been able to pay our bills. When the child tax credits payments arrived in July 2021, we felt like our elected leaders were finally recognizing what families like ours were facing. That $800 per month was world-changing. It helped us pay down debt, it helped us cope with the rising cost of groceries, and it helped us re-enroll our child in his beloved preschool. The cost was $300 higher a month, and the hours were shorter. As so many other preschools, ours had to adjust. It felt the pressures of COVID and the larger situation, but that preschool was vital for our son and for our ability to work. And then in January, just as the new variant was surging, Congress failed to extend the child tax credit. That extra income that was helping our family recover disappeared. The past 2 months have been a nightmare. Our youngest child's preschool closed twice due to COVID outbreaks. All 3 children became ill with COVID, and our eldest, while still weak and contracted Epstein-Barr virus. He is needed to stay home for many weeks to heal. And then our school bus driver caught COVID, and there are no substitute drivers right now. As my husband has no paid leave and has never had any paid leave, and mine is limited, over the past 2 months, I've had to juggle taking care of our kids, transporting them to and from school, along with my work responsibilities as a specialist in early learning. I participate in work meetings while driving my kids to school. I work early in the morning and I stay and work late at night to make up for lost time during the day. My nonstop 15-hour days mean that I cannot rest enough and my new autoimmune condition flares up. 2 years into this pandemic, and Congress still hasn't guaranteed workers paid family and medical leave. Without this basic safety net, families can't catch up. It's only March and I've already drained my paid leave for the year. In fact, I'm using my final hours to be here today, to share with you, our elected leaders, the impossible trade-offs that my family and so many other families are forced to make. And just to be clear, all of these issues predate the pandemic. The past 2 years has simply intensified the problems. Without adequate care infrastructure, we have to choose between working enough hours to pay our bills and taking care of our children and our health. Between counseling and tutoring for our children, much needed to recover from the pandemic, and paying down debt. That is not right. After 2 years of this pandemic, we're at a crucial decision point. Will Congress fund the care infrastructure that children and families need to recover and to thrive? Or will you turn your back on children and allow families to slide from financial insecurity into financial disaster? As you discuss how to rebuild from this pandemic, please remember my family and all the other families. I hope you will work to build a better America, one that works for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walker, for your testimony. I now recognize Mrs. Lukas here in the hearing room. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Carrie, Lukas, president of Independent Women's Forum. Independent Women's Forum is a nonprofit organization dedicated to developing and advancing policies that aren't just well-intended, but that actually enhance people's freedoms, opportunity, and well-being. IWF employs about 30 full-time employees and more than a dozen additional contractors and fellows. We've studied the issue of women's employment as a policy topic, but I also know about this firsthand as an employer. I'm a working mother of 5 children between ages 7 and 16, so I know personally about balancing work and family life. Before we consider what policies will help women re-enter the workforce, we need to be clear about why women left in the first place. After all, women didn't leave the workforce just because of a virus, but really because of society's response to COVID-19. Women had made record labor force gains during the Trump administration, and unfortunately, these gains were lost during the pandemic and the economic shutdowns that followed, and we have yet to fully recover. But these economic losses have not been uniform throughout the country. Rather, they have been most profound in states that most aggressively shut down schools and locked down their economies. In these states, which are disproportionately led by Democratic governors and state legislatures, women are still suffering the worst economic effects and have the highest rates of unemployment. Reduced earnings and lower labor force participation will lead to lower earnings for women, not just today, but for years to come. So Congress should consider 4 lessons we've learned from this experience to inform policy-making decisions moving forward. The first lesson that we learned is that our public K-12 school system is fundamentally flawed and needs to be reformed. Like many working parents during COVID-19, I had to juggle my job along with managing my 5 kids' schooling online. Where I lived in Virginia, private schools all opened at the start of 2020 with in-person learning, but our public schools fought to stay closed for as long as possible until mid-April 2021. Public schools behave this way because they don't see parents and students as their customers. And why would they? Their ability to pay the bills and keep their jobs depends on pleasing government officials and not serving families. We need to change this dynamic. We need to fundamentally transform our K-12 public education system so that schools see parents and students as valued customers and never again fail families and our country so spectacularly. Rather than funding systems, money should follow each student so that parents have leverage, and schools know that if they fail to provide value, parents will take their business elsewhere. Second, and relatedly, do not embrace any policy that would make our daycare and preschool system function more like public K-12. At the height of the pandemic, about 60% of child care centers closed, but by the end of 2020, an estimated 73% of preschool, daycare, and child care programs had reopened. In contrast, at the end of 2020, only about 1/3 of public K-12 schools were opening. Imagine how much worse women would have suffered if our daycare system was run like our public schools and had refused to provide in-person service. Policymakers should find ways to make childcare more affordable, plentiful, and diverse, including eliminating unnecessary regulations that raise the cost of childcare. But they should reject plans like those contained in Build Back Better, which would have made government the funder of daycare and reoriented providers towards pleasing regulators and policymakers instead of families and parents. Third, women need a diversity of work and employment opportunities. And we frequently hear that women need flexibility, but what does flexibility mean? True flexibility means having a range of employment options. This is why about 23 million women work as independent contractors. They want more freedom and control. Of course, some women want full-time work and benefits, and that should be their choice, but measures to try to limit people's ability to work as independent contractors, such as contained in the PRO Act, will backfire on women and force millions of women to face a black and white choice of either accepting a 9-to-5 style job or leaving the workforce entirely. This policy approach should be rejected. Finally, everyone wants workers to have paid leave, and policymakers should work to help people access financial support when they need to take leave. Yet the wrong approach would be to create a one-size-fits-all federal paid leave entitlement program or mandate. One-size-fits-all entitlement systems leave workers worse off with less income and less true flexibility, and for many, reduced benefits. They take money from lower income workers in the form of payroll taxes and transfer that money to wealthier workers. This has been shown time and again. This approach also should be rejected. Today, employers face tremendous headwinds, inflation, shortages, rising labor costs, and extraordinary uncertainty. And these are mostly driven by bad policy choices and government overspending. Policymakers need to embrace the concept of doing no harm, stop overspending, and intervening in the economy in ways that leave workers poorer and with less opportunity to find work relationships that allow them to pursue their own visions of happiness. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. We will now begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, members can submit questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and responses will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so by sending them electronically to the email inbox we have established within 7 days of the hearing. I will, as my habit, defer my questioning to the end, so I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The expanded tax credit was initiated in July and extended through December. During that period of time, about 3.7 million kids were pulled out of poverty, and the reduction in poverty rates in America was about 30%. 10,000 kids in America are born every day, and 10,000 people turn 65 every single day. An earlier program called Social Security provided income security for those 65 and older and pulled about 50% of the elderly population in America out of poverty. This expanded child tax credit was particularly effective over this 6-month period of time. And the whole idea here is if you have 100,000 kids that are born every day, or 10,000 that are born every day, you are investing in the future productivity of young people by helping making them happier, healthier, and thus more productive. We should all, regardless of our political persuasion, want our people to be more economically independent and self-sufficient. And I think this is a program that is proven to be highly effective. Dr. Albanesi, you teach economics, correct?
Yes, I do.
You teach economics at the University of Pennsylvania.
At the University of Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh,
yes.
I'm sorry, University of Pittsburgh. You focus in on macroeconomics and labor economics as it relates to women and families?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Do you have any evidence of a cost-benefit analysis to the expanded child tax credit as it relates to the amount of money we spend on the program compared to what the increased productivity is of young people that benefit from it to and through adulthood?
Yes, actually, there's quite a bit of economic research on the impact of, additional spending, on young children, both in terms of the educational opportunities, sort of being able to enroll children in better childcare and preschool options and so on. So that has been demonstrated to actually improve achievement of children later on in life and actually have community level benefits such as reducing crime rates and increasing income overall. There's also benefits for parents, in the, of these children in terms of greater ability to work. And there's also some benefits in the very long run. You may have read that one of the reasons why the millennial generation is postponing and reducing the number of kids that they want to have is that kids are very expensive. So that is really generating demographic stress on our society. So because there are, fewer and fewer young people because of the declining fertility rates due to the high cost of raising children. So there would be long-term macro benefits from that, in terms of possibly stimulating fertility as well.
Thank you, Doctor. So I guess here's what I'm getting at here. Brown University did a study concluding that over the past 2 decades, America spent $6.2 trillion in 3 Middle East wars. Not one kid was lifted out of poverty. Not one family was helped with affordable childcare, and not one kid benefited from universal pre-K. And, the economics of war is terrible. It doesn't produce any economic benefit that is broadly felt. There are value investments, and the child tax credit, I believe, is one of them. A fellow economist of yours, Mark Zandi from Moody's Analytics, said that for every dollar that you spend in infrastructure in America, you can produce $1.60 in economic activity. So the return on investment for that dollar that you spend is 60%. Conservative economist, he also did an analysis on the tax cut, primarily for corporations, and said for every dollar that you spent for that tax cut, $1.9 trillion, you could expect to get a return of about 33 cents. So your loss in investment was 67%. So it would be helpful in advocating for expanded child tax credit, universal pre-K, and affordable quality childcare if we could associate, if it's achievable, a dollar amount spent to a dollar amount returned in terms of economic activity. And I see that my time has run out. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now yield 10 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Lukas, since the start of COVID-19 over 2 years ago, we have watched politicians and elected officials enact lockdowns, mandates, and decrees on those they were entrusted to represent. More often than not, these actions were not backed up by science, but more an assumption that Americans couldn't be trusted to make the best decisions for themselves. One of the most harmful of these policies was forced school closures and virtual classrooms. Kids suffered, parents suffered, and we are still playing catch up today. I've argued that this was harmful to students first and foremost, but also harmful to parents, particularly working mothers. Could you take a moment, based on your personal experience as a working mother of 5 school-age children, as well as what you have heard from parents in your community and elsewhere, to explain the impact of some of these pandemic responses, like school closures, on kids, families, and particularly on working mothers?
Well, absolutely. I do think that that when you think about the mistakes that were made, when we look back at the response to COVID-19, what happened in public schools and the K through 12 schools is going to stand out as the worst policy that was enacted. And it did mean that many parents, especially those who did not have jobs that could be done remotely, that they were forced into impossible choices, leaving children behind to try to log on themselves, to essentially miss school during that time, or to quit their jobs. But when I think about this, I do think about this mostly from the children, and as Mr. Higgins was just referring to, when we think about the dollar numbers that are associated with this, children lost on average 6 months of learning when it came to math. But this was not across the board. A fellow witness talked about systematic or systemic inequities, but it was minority children. It was African American children who were the most harmed by this. Their schools stayed closed the longest, and they suffered the worst learning losses. And I do think this is something that should be eye-opening to everyone. Democrats and Republicans should be asking why. Why did our public schools not care and not prioritize our children?
Under the economic policies of the Trump administration, which included tax relief and regulatory relief, workforce participation for mothers reached 72.4%, the highest since 2000. Over 3.5 million jobs were created for women under Trump, securing 56% of the job gains and lifting women's employment to the highest level in history. Women's wages grew by 9.6% as well. But under President Biden, earnings for women have gone down by 2.6%. In fact, the wage gap between women and men grew smaller under President Trump, while the the gap is now widening under President Biden. What policies should the government be pursuing right now to help close the workforce participation gap between where it was under President Trump and his policies to where it is today under President Biden, as well as address the widening wage gap occurring under President Biden?
You know, I think that one of the lessons for Congress is first, again, this idea of doing no harm, because I do think when it looks at what has caused so many problems, it has been the forced closures, the regulations that have been put on business that's made it so hard for them to stay open. You look around cities like here in Washington, where so many of the local businesses are no longer open, the eateries that have closed because of the economic shutdowns. So I think first, let's open up. America needs to open up and stay open for business so that there is some security. We need to be confident that our schools are not going to close again. For a lot of moms who've stepped out, they were worrying about school closures all this year. Some had their kids sent home again during Omicron. That cannot be the default. We have to be able to have some security in knowing that we're going to be able to continue to participate.
Ms. Lukas, I'd have to say the people of Missouri would agree with your statements 100%. And speaking of a lot of regulations, as of February 2022, 80% of the states with the lowest Black female unemployment rates have Republican governors. Of the 20 states with the highest Black female unemployment rates, 70% have Democrat governors. President Obama's economist, Larry Summers, cites vaccine mandates as something which took upwards of 400,000 people out of the workforce. Given the overall Black vaccination rates are behind those of the overall population by 28 percentage points, can you speak to how policies that Democrat-run states have pursued, especially things like vaccine mandates, would contribute to a disproportionate impact on Black females and opportunities they would have to enter the workforce?
Well, absolutely. With this lower rate of vaccination among African-American women, this is just locking people out of jobs. And I do think that, we've had, we think about the decisions that were being made 2 years ago when COVID was just coming into effect. We now know so much more. And especially when it comes to post-Omicron, we know that these types of mandates are no longer necessary. Your vaccine status does not affect my risks. So we should show some kindness, allow true diversity of allowing people to make choices that work for them so that they can work and we can all get on with our lives and respect people and not continue to create unnecessary barriers for people's participation.
Thank you. Another idea our Democrat colleagues proposed is government-mandated pre-K, which would give government more control over education decisions. Well, we've seen over the past few years what happens when overly emboldened school boards and local officials think they know best what kids should be learning. In November, the Independent Women's Forum published a piece noting that the use of critical race theory has emerged in a neighboring district to mine. To what extent do you see local officials or even federal officials with the type of government mandates Democrats have suggested trying to dictate the type of curriculum, care, and teaching for American kids?
I think this is so important. We've seen when it comes to K through 12 public schools, they become such a flashpoint. And it is because parents no longer feel confident that their public schools have their kids' best interest at heart. And this is true when it comes to curriculum, to masking policies, to a health decision, to gender. And I do worry, I think that parents out there should be warned that if the federal government takes over childcare and daycare centers and preschools and begins to decide what is a qualified daycare center and what can be opened or subsidized, parents are going to be fighting these same battles over curriculum, CRT, gender ideology are all going to come to your local preschools, and preschools are going to be in a terrible position. More than 50% of childcare are faith-based, and they're going to have a very hard time meeting with the demands of regulators, and I fear that they'll be crowded out. That's why I absolutely reject the idea that federal government should take over our preschool programs.
So parents know best for their children, not the government. Thank you. My final question, and this is for all witnesses. This past Friday, we mark the one-year anniversary since congressional Democrats and President Biden pushed through a $2 trillion spending bill that they claimed was needed to combat COVID-19. A year later, it is now obvious their spending has done little to combat COVID-19. In fact, less than 9% of the spending was even earmarked for such purposes. And they're already back asking for more COVID-19 money anyway. It is also obvious that unleashing this flood of spending sparked a massive spike in consumer prices that are crippling family budgets and undermining Americans' paychecks because of a 40-year high in inflation. How have these high prices and spending-driven inflation affected you, your household budgets, and others in your community? And that's for all witnesses.
Does anyone want to take that question first? But since Mrs. Lukas has had the balance of the time, does anybody want to? We only have a minute left in the ranking member's time.
Well, Ms. Lukas can go first since it's taking so long. Let's hear from Ms. Lukas
Sure.
first.
It is. We were talking about about how many people needed support, and they're talking about the importance of a $300 a month check. But now we see, as inflation, as you're seeing 10% increases in housing costs, the doubling of gas prices, childcare costs going up. We are going to be we are chasing this with inflation is eating up any support of those rising wages, and it's just been devastating. It's something that every mom sees every time she walks into the grocery store, every time she goes to buy her kids, the birthday present and those things. It's incredibly harmful and threatening a lot of insecurity right now, where we look to what the future is going to be.
Okay, well, you've succeeded in your filibuster, Mr. Smith, so.
It's getting the facts for the American people to see what's going on. Thank you.
Your time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, for 5 minutes.
Listening to the gentleman's diatribe, I think perhaps he lives in a parallel universe. I live in a state with a Republican governor, perhaps the worst governor Texas has ever had. And the cost being paid by Texas women, particularly women of color, poorer women, is an immense cost of being left uninsured, without access to adequate child care, often with interference in local public health decisions that have made this pandemic and its impact so much worse. But to focus in on the topic of the day and the apparent willingness of the Republican members of our committee to do nothing from the federal level to meet the challenge of inadequate child care and lack of early educational opportunities that have enjoyed strong bipartisan support in the past. I want to pose a question to our excellent witnesses and just offer an additional comment. I think if we're to build a better Texas and a better America, we've got to build a better future for women across the country. A stronger foundation is needed on which a woman's hard-earned paycheck isn't eaten up by the very same caregiving that enables her to leave home to go to work every day. Many parents about the crushing burden of navigating childcare, of finding quality childcare, safe childcare, and parenting during this pandemic. Some Texans have been more than ready to return to work, but the lack of childcare prompted them to drop out of the workforce, disproportionately on women. And parents who have found childcare in recent months have had no guarantees each morning when they drop off their child as to whether a call would come to quarantine because of COVID. Expanding affordable childcare is a key to unlocking more opportunity and economic security for parents, and particularly for mothers. And it's important to all of us to reinvigorate our economy by getting these women back into the workforce and having the support they need to do just that. High quality care is essential to early learning, it's essential to economic development, but years of insufficient funding and a devastating pandemic have sharpened the crisis for our providers, while costs have often been inaccessible, made care inaccessible for families. And quality child care costs more than tuition at a four-year college. And for an infant, it's even more expensive. For years, I've worked to try to ensure that we get the healthcare coverage gap closed. And I've been concerned in recent legislation that we ensure we don't open a second coverage gap in the event that the ideological commitment of some of these Republican state governors, like mine in Texas, refuses federal support for child. It is essential that our legislation provide that local governments can step forward, as they did when we had a failed President Trump and governors that refused to lead and got us through the pandemic, that those local officials will be able to access any federal funds to protect our children's futures and our parents' progress. Of course, the child tax credit, continuing it is so important. But Ms. Walker, I appreciate your testimony. Let me just ask you in the time remaining to comment further on the need for the critical provision of childcare, particularly for children from infancy on. Can you speak a little more about that and your family's experience and the need to do this for everyone, regardless of the code or the whim of some politician?
Thank you for that question. And I'm speaking as a mother, but also as an early education specialist from more of a decade of experience partnering with providers in daycares and preschools. Research and common sense both show us that 0 to 5 is a critical period for a child, a human's development. In our current system, from what I see in my work as I collaborate with providers in all sorts of different settings, it's not working. We're not able to pay a living wage to so many of our workers who do this incredibly valuable work. And it's not working for our families because it's an incredible cost. So what I see time and time again is that it's not working. There's a prohibitive cost. There's not enough space and options. I hear from families who have incredibly long drives in rural areas. I hear from families that are 2.5 years on a wait list. Again, these are our children. These are our youngest citizens, and they deserve our best. And what I see is that across the board, there's work to be done.
Thank you very much for your testimony and the contribution of all of our witnesses. I yield back.
Yeah, gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to start, this is not just pandemic related. I go back to my wife of 31 years. She's when I mobilized in 2009 and 2010 to Iraq, she raised 2 preteen children. She carried a baby for 9 months. She delivered that baby. She worked a job, and she took care of everything on the home front. So you want to talk about, I don't understand where she got the determination, the dexterity, all the things that are necessary. But here's the difference between my wife and I, and these are the things we need to address, but we're asking the wrong people. We get people up here with PhDs who are Washington elitists or elitists somewhere else. We don't ask the rural people of Mississippi who have a hard time, what can we do to make it better? But my wife has been allowed to have jobs. I've been allowed to have a career. That is the difference in earning power, is that I can sustain a career because of what she sacrificed to her family. COVID hit, inflation from all the money that we spent. What does that mean? It doesn't mean all these big words. It means groceries are higher. It means gas costs too much to go, that we've intentionally inflated gas prices like we did under the first Obama administration. It means that daycare is not available, or if it is, it costs so much. We don't talk about rural broadband. So most of my people don't even have broadband, so they don't have a virtual option. They can't get health care, they can't get education, they can't do all those things. Ms. Lukas, you seem to get it. Trust me, we're outnumbered 1.5 to 1 in my family. You're outnumbered 2.5 to 1, okay? So much greater. What 3 policies have hurt the most in the COVID pandemic that have hurt working mothers and their ability to form careers, not jobs?
You know, I want to talk a little bit about, I love the idea of this difference between career and jobs, but I want to just say one thing as a mom, is a lot of moms really want jobs. And I want to make sure that as we talk about the role of being a caregiver, that we recognize that a lot of women make sacrifices and do. When we talk about what drives the wage gap, a lot of women have decided that they're going to take a step back and intentionally not make as much money, make a sacrifice so that they can have the capacity to support their support their family and be present for their children. I want that to be their right, and that's we shouldn't measure everything by money or the amount of money earned, although we of course want women to have income earning opportunities. But of course, when a lot of people did lose jobs, and it wasn't by choice, it was because of these economic closures, which made it impossible to work, literally just drove businesses out of business. It was these school closures, which were so devastating to working families, but particularly working moms. And I think there are like a lot of other burdens, including the runaway spending, that have helped fuel this inflation, which is now hurting women as consumers, but also as business women and as workers.
Thank you. And, I'm just thinking there's so I've served a long time in the military. My wife has gone through 3 deployments, and it completely tears a family apart when you have to do those things. But that being said, I was always afforded the ability as a military service member, when I was taken out of my civilian job, when I came back, I got any pay raises, any promotions, any things that would have occurred positively to me. I came back in at least as good and usually better position than I left. Is there something we can do for working mothers during that critical times when they have kids in school, when they have they're having birth of their first child or second child, and they're taken out of the workforce, not by that, or they have to care for an aging parent, which in many cases falls on women, not men. Is there an opportunity to look at something that is much like the Military Leave Act that could apply to mothers in the workforce?
Independent Women's Forum has explored a lot how we can expand paid leave, especially for those with lower incomes. The problem is that so often the well-intended approaches on paid leave, and we've seen this in some states, states like Rhode Island and California, where they do enact a paid leave program that taxes and gives a defined set of benefits, and that ends up usually backfiring, especially on those low-income workers, and we've seen reduced labor force participation and lower wages, which is exactly the opposite of what we want. Independent Women's Forum has looked at how to make the existing entitlement programs, things like Social Security, accessible to people, a woman who has just had a baby, so she would be able to receive some of that Social Security money early and then pay it back later, so it would be budget neutral. So there are ideas, innovative, out-of-the-box ideas worth exploring.
Final comments. We've just got to pay attention to the working class and rural populations who actually earn, and things that work for them, not the elites. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our panel for a very helpful discussion. I want to refer to a couple of tables that maybe they can be entered in the record as the predicate for my question. They come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they were included in some of the preparatory material we had today. And ask maybe any of our witnesses who wish to comment on these, maybe starting with our economist and going on from there. One of the charts has to do with the return to the labor force of men and women, the comparison of the rates of return to the labor force, something like 1.4 million job differential between the return to the labor force of men and women, return to the 2020 level of employment. And then another table that indicates that while women's labor force participation rates have recovered modestly, they're still below historic highs. That does raise some additional question of why they declined after 2008 a couple of points. But in any case, they're considerably short of the historic highs now in this period as the pandemic eases. There's been a lot of focus today, and you did a very good job of focusing on the care economy and the way the care economy, of course, especially affects women, and the gaps in the care economy that may account for a lot of this failure to return to the labor force. There's also been discussion, though, of the kind of discernment that workers, men and women, may be exercising in this period as they think about returning to the labor force. And not everyone, of course, has the luxury of exercising that kind of discernment. Some just have to do the best they can, but others may be reflecting on their low wages or their inadequate benefits. And in the case of women, of course, there's even more to reflect on in terms of wage discrimination and various kinds of challenges in the workplace that if they're able, they may just not want to put up with anymore, or at least they want to bargain for a better deal. So that does raise the question: to what extent have they gotten a better deal? What can you tell us about the way, how widespread this is? First of all, the extent to which employers, wages, benefits, those kinds of things have responded to this and have helped draw people back to the labor force. And to what extent have they fallen short? You see where I'm coming here. I'm getting away from the care economy to some of these other factors that have to do with the attractiveness of the jobs that are available, and whether people have an inclination, whether they have the discretion and the inclination to hold out for better conditions. So I would appreciate. There's been a lot of talk about this, and I'd appreciate your helping us reflect on it.
Yes. Thank you, Representative. A couple of points there. So if we look at labor force participation, we need to distinguish, women and men with a college education as opposed to women and men without a college education. So if we look at college graduates, their participation hasn't really declined, even for parents and mothers with children. They have been extremely stressed by the fact that in addition to working remotely, they've had to take care of their children, but their participation hasn't dropped very much. So most of the decline in participation is for women without a college degree. And those are the women that work in these inflexible occupations, so the care economy, production jobs, and so on. And also the decline in participation that we've seen is not coming from women who just quit their job. It's coming for women who became unemployed first. So the fact that certain services, were hit by the fact that, not just the mitigation measures. So what we've seen from foot traffic data coming from cell phones is well before mitigation measures were introduced. People stopped going to restaurants, people stopped going to the gym, and so on. So the risk of infection affects behavior even before, the government may mandate that, restaurants should only do takeout. And so that is an important observation, because the women who were able to keep their job, they struggled immensely, but they kept it. And women who were laid off, eventually, left the workforce. And that is a combination of these childcare, and care needs in general, but also maybe the perspective of not being able to get another job in the same industry. So we've known that, one of the reasons why leisure and hospitality jobs haven't recovered is not necessarily, government mandated closures. At this point, there are none in the United States. But for example, business travel has dropped dramatically. People do Zooms now. They don't, fly to another city for a meeting. And so the leisure and hospitality service is experiencing what we refer to as a reallocation shock. So jobs in that sector are going to be permanently lower. So if you were working in that sector and you lost your job, you might, not have a job to go back to. And so you don't even look, particularly if you're also saddled with childcare needs. So the issue is quite complex. And, there's always a demand side, demand for certain jobs has permanently declined as a function of the pandemic. And then there's also the supply side, all these sort of childcare challenges that we've been discussing. And it's useful to sort of look at both to better understand what's going on.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, but I would invite any of the other witnesses who want to supply some helpful information on this to do so for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, Mr. Price, is there a specific request you have to submit information for the record?
No, we didn't get to the other witnesses, and if they have a response to the question I posed, the kind of explanation that Dr. Albanesi gave, I would appreciate them supplementing the record.
I will ask for unanimous consent that if you have material you submit for the record that, Mr. Price, that it be approved without objection. So ordered. And now your time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for scheduling this important hearing. We, I think, all share concern of the impact that COVID had on women and their families, and of the impact that government policies relative to COVID, in response to COVID, has had on women. And so I think it is a good time to evaluate our policies, and I think everyone watching can know that we all share the desire to help women and their families achieve their own American dream, and we hear some of the issues that you all are faced with, and particularly Ms. Walker. We thank you for sharing your story, which is similar to many other stories of other families. So it is a good time to look at the impact of policies and what is affecting American families. And I can tell you the number one issue, maybe second to Ukraine and security, is inflation today. And I think Democrat policies that have been put forth directly resulted or at least had a significant impact on inflation and the impact that's been felt by women and their families. I received over 1,000 inputs from constituents in my district in regard to how inflation is impacting them. I think about Connie, who is 70 years old from the town of New Holland in my district. She recently picked up a part-time job to make ends meet because of the price increases caused by inflation. Tanya from Lancaster had trouble keeping her home at a comfortable temperature this winter due to high energy costs. And Sherry from Columbia, Pennsylvania, tells me that inflation restricts, and I quote, what she eats and where she goes. Not only does she feel the pinch at the grocery store and at the pump, but she also recognizes that inflation undermines all her buying power. So, Mr. Chairman, if we're scheduling hearings on impacts and what our constituents are feeling, I would certainly suggest that we do a hearing specifically looking at the impact of inflation, what's causing that, and how we can prevent it. I think it'd be a great topic. We knew one of the moments that I'm proud of here is when we came together in a bipartisan way and passed the CARE Act, brought together the drug industry through Operation Warp Speed. We were together to combat the impacts of COVID. But we couldn't have disagreed more on the need or the impact of the $1.9 trillion rescue plan. I can tell you that economists were telling us that it would result in years of inflation like we hadn't seen in a long, long time. The Democrats were warned about that when we passed it. Larry Summers has already been mentioned here. I quote, and of course he was the Treasury Secretary on Clinton, he said, I quote, "I think this is the least responsible macroeconomic policy that we've had in the last 40 years. He also wrote in the Washington Post that the proposed $1.9 trillion stimulus could ignite inflationary pressures of a kind that we have not seen in a generation. That's turned out to be true. We now have 40-year highs in inflation, and it's a direct result of misguided policies putting trillions of dollars into the economy that did, frankly, more harm than good, and not much of that bill went directly to combat inflation anyway. And so I agree we should be looking at this, but we should be clear-eyed about what is happening, what has caused that, and what we can do to fix it. And I'm sorry, Lukas, didn't have your name. Can you just react to that? I'd like to hear your response. And I want to say one other thing. You know, it was brought up that women's income, real income, because of inflation, has declined 2.6%, compared to in the previous administration had grown by 9.6%. But could you talk just a little about whether you agree, how you feel about the impact of inflation on women?
Yeah, and you know, I'd like to talk, I've heard a lot of calls for additional spending, and that worries me. And I think another thing we really need to explore is all the unspent money. You look at this, the calls for increased funding of daycare. Well, right now, there are 20 states that have not spent even 50% of the money that was allocated as a part of these COVID relief packages. Public schools have over $150 billion left in COVID money. What are they doing with it? I mean, why can't we give this to parents? I hear the stories of people having to pay for tutoring. Why are they paying that? Don't let the public schools keep that money. Give it to people like my fellow witness who are paying for tutoring to make up for the job that their public schools didn't do. Before we spend more money, let's make sure that we actually track what's happened with those that you guys have already allocated.
Thank you, and I'm out of time.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Tchaikovsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to enter into the record a letter and report from the Chicago Foundation for Women an organization that for the last 30 years has really focused on in lifting up women and girls. And in their report, among other things, they say, quote, how they discuss how, quote, caregiving responsibility has landed squarely on women throughout the pandemic. So if I could have unanimous.
Without objection.
Okay. I would like to devote the rest of my time to Ajahn Poo. She is, as you know now, the Executive Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and caring across the generations, who has done so much, I think, to raise the important issues of what the needs are right now in our economy and for so many people. And if you would focus especially on workers, you know, we call them the heroes of the pandemic, and yet they are in such great need. If you could talk for a while. 5 minutes is so short that you had before. Take the rest of my time.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. I do want to take a moment to just name that among the fastest growing job categories in our entire economy, not just for women, but in our entire economy, are personal care aides and home health care workers. And these are workers who earn on average $18,200 per year. Because of the growing aging population in this country, we know that the demand for this workforce is only going to continue to grow. Congressman earlier mentioned rural communities. There are massive home care deserts throughout rural communities all over this country because we have labor shortages. Workers cannot survive on the income that they earn and pay for gas to get to work on the incomes that they earn. They don't have access to health care or a safety net or paid time off. The quality of these jobs is so poor that we cannot sustain the current workforce we have, let alone the huge demand that we need going into the future as an aging nation. We have the opportunity to make these jobs good jobs for the 21st century, just like we did for manufacturing jobs in the 30s, where one generation could do better than the next. If we invest in care jobs becoming living wage jobs with real economic security and access to a safety net, we will create a pathway to the middle class for literally millions of working class and working poor women and their families. It's a huge, it's a win-win-win investment. And the cost of elder care to states right now is extraordinary because of our over-reliance on nursing homes and nursing home care. When we invest in a home care workforce and home and community-based services, which is a big part of the plan in the Build Back Better agenda, when we invest in home and community-based services, we are investing in cost savings on the part of states and the federal government long-term, because the cost of home and community-based care is a third of what it costs states to pay for nursing home care for people who need it. So it is a win-win-win. Lower costs for states and the federal government, better jobs for a group of workers who've been forced to live in working poverty and their families, support for working family caregivers who need the support of a strong workforce and access to these programs in order to participate in the economy, and a dignified quality of life for our growing aging population in this country and people with disabilities who need these services and prefer to live and age in the home and community. What could be a better investment of our public dollars? And in investing in this workforce, these are job-enabling jobs. They are supporting all of us, working class families who need this care, to be able to do and contribute what we want to on our terms across all sectors of the economy. So I do want to say that the care economy investments are, in my mind, the highest return on investment, both from a job standpoint and from a long-term economic sustainability for working class family standpoint.
Thank you so much. Appreciate this
these additional awards. Appreciate it.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
And thank you, Chairman. And first off, let me just start with the fact that I disagree with my colleague from Texas, and I think Governor Greg Abbott has been one of the best governors the state has had, and I only say one of the best because Rick Perry and George W. Bush were his immediate predecessors, and I certainly don't want to slight their service either because they've all been important. Look, a year ago at the Rules Committee, I introduced the very same opinion pieces that Mr. Smucker just talked about that former Chairman Larry Summers had written because, as it turns out, he was a regular Nostradamus with his ability to predict what was going to happen. We had the chairman of the Fed at that time saying inflation not a worry. But look, those of us who are old enough to remember what it was like going through the inflationary spiral of the 70s and early 80s also remember how painful it was to unwind that inflationary spiral. And look, let's be honest, people at upper income levels were inconvenienced. People at the lower income levels were devastated. And that is the price that is paid for those types of policies. I'm so grateful Ms. Lukas mentioned about the oversight of the spending that went into that $1.9 trillion bill, because I think it is important. And Mr. Chairman, I just got to say, it's my first term on the Budget Committee. We haven't done a budget. And if you don't do a budget, then if you don't plan, then how do you know if you get to where you thought you wanted to go? We also have not heard from the Congressional Budget Office. Congressional Budget Office has not done the CBO baseline for this year. And they say the problem is OMB, fair enough, but people ought to get their acts together, and this is too important to just leave undone. Now, Congressional Budget Office did come in and visit with me, and they went through a list of 20 of the top 20 agencies and institutes that have unspent money from the American Rescue Plan. And it turns out just in the top 20, that's $340 billion. The aggregate of all the unspent money is over $400 billion. So yeah, actually there is some money there that could go to help people. And here's another problem. A lot of that money went to the states before it gets doled out to municipalities and to individuals. We've not done any oversight of how the states have done with getting that money where we intended it to go. So it's very, very difficult to talk about new spending when we haven't done a good job with trying to keep track of what's already gone out the door. And look, just like everybody else, I voted for the CARES Act in March of 2020. I thought it was important. We didn't know what was ahead of us. It was uncertain times, and we were in uncharted waters. But since that time, we've not done, and I'm also on one of the authorizing committees on energy and commerce, we've not sat down and done the work on what was actually needed. We had all the money dispensed in the CARES Act, but we never sat down and said what was actually needed, where did it go? Could we have done more? Should we have done less? Were we inappropriate in some of our expenditures? So we get to the end of the year and do a big omnibus, and we don't even know. We don't know because we've not asked the questions and we've not done the proper oversight. So I was opposed to the omnibus bill in December of 2020, even though there was a consensus around its passage. But then not 2 months later, we're passing another $1.9 trillion bill. And we ask ourselves, well, why does it cost so much at the grocery store, at the gas station? Well, it was as plain as the nose on your face, and even the former Secretary of the Treasury was able to recognize that. Ms. Lukas, I do actually have a question for you. You've posed a very interesting concept that mandatory paid leave programs are wealth transfer, but it's counterintuitive. The people that you thought you were going to help, you hadn't helped, and you gave help to people that probably didn't need the help in the first place. Would you care to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I do think a lot of people, really want to help people and they see paid leave, and everybody feels bad when somebody has to make a real sacrifice and they need time off from work. But these programs are simply not serving who they're supposed to serve. When you look at in Rhode Island, you look at these income brackets, and the places that are getting the most, the income cohort that's getting the largest payout is the upper income. It is the lowest income bracket that is the least likely to be taking these benefits. It's incredibly regressive, and that's clearly we need to go back to the drawing board and not commit that on a federal level.
Correct, and of course, the taxes are collected in payroll taxes from those lowest income workers.
Exactly.
They don't pay income tax, but they do pay
Payroll
employment
tax.
taxes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentlemen, time has expired. I just note for the record that my Republican colleagues who often criticize Ivy elites are very free with their compliments of a Harvard guy today. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate very much you holding this hearing and your interest in ensuring that women are able to fully participate in our changing economy. I also want to thank our witnesses for their tremendous insight, particularly as these issues have disproportionately affected women, especially women of color, in their involvement in the labor market. We are working hard to make sure, as we have seen, 7.4 million jobs created in the first 13 months of this new administration. However, we know that there are still many who are struggling, and there's more work that we have to do. So first, I want to touch on the fact that the effects of the pandemic and the subsequent economic downturn were not felt equally across all racial and socioeconomic groups. The jobs that disappeared were predominantly held by women, and they were predominantly held by women of color. These were the essential workers who kept our country running during the darkest days of the pandemic, and now they are being rewarded, quote unquote, with reduced hours, little opportunity for remote work, and in many cases, no options for childcare. Our communities of color are being left behind, and while the COVID-19 pandemic laid bare their tenuous position, the vulnerabilities within our economy for workers of color existed long before 2020 and the pandemic. So Dr. Albanesi's testimony, I know you touched about the systemic makeup of our country's occupational distribution set up many women of color for failure. So will you briefly discuss the economic impact of decreased labor force participation by women of color, and provide us with your thoughts on how we can help to train more women for who are facing low contact, flexible jobs like you discussed earlier in your testimony?
Yes, thank you, Representative. Yes, it's true. Particularly Black and Hispanic women are overrepresented in these inflexible, high-contact occupations, basically in the care economy that Ms. Pu has so eloquently described for us. And wages in those occupations are low for two reasons. They're low because they're primarily female occupations. And as economists, we've done a lot of work to understand gender wage gaps. And it turns out that when occupations are predominantly female, wages in those occupations are lower, even if those occupations require the same qualification as another occupation that is primarily male. But also, historically in the care economy, there have not been enough protections that are standard in other types of occupations. And this is really a heritage of the kind of structural barriers to advancement of people of color when these programs of employment protections were first introduced in the 30s. So if we as a society value employment protection, we should be giving it to all our workers and not just giving it to some kinds of workers and not other kinds of workers. That is inefficient. It causes disallocation of talent, and it causes a crisis where many families desperately need care for their elderly relatives or for their children, and they can't find workers because workers in those occupations are underpaid. So how do we solve this problem? The problem, I think Ms. Wu had, several suggestions in her testimony. If we just equate the kind of protections that are given to other workers for care workers, that would do a lot to even the playing field and attract more talent to those sectors. But I also want to recognize that, as I said before, as a result of the pandemic, there's been some structural change in the economy. I mentioned, sort of business travel is expected to be permanently lower. The fact that more people are working from home who can, several surveys that have been conducted, by employers and by economists suggesting that going forward, more people are going to be working from home if they can, more days, which means all those restaurants and cafeterias and other jobs that are connected to serving people who work in offices or other establishments, those jobs may not come back to the extent that we saw them in 2019. So there's going to be a demand for certain types of jobs that were, primarily employing, women of color. So there's a need to offer retraining and other, kinds of services to enable those women to enter other occupations that are, growing in response to the pandemic and demographic change, such as the care occupations.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I know I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I did want to just highlight Mrs. Walker's testimony and her focus on the child tax credit. And I'm really proud that your youngest son was able to go back to preschool based on that child tax credit. And that's why we're working to provide those benefits for so many families. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having this hearing. From the start of this pandemic, the number of active small businesses has plummeted, with minority and female-owned businesses disproportionately impacted. And that's because while lockdowns and temporary business closures were intended to address the public health crisis, women and minority-owned businesses were more likely to fall under the arbitrary designation of non-essential. These designations were put forward by aggressive administrations of Democrat-led governors, and therefore these businesses were forced to close with very few resources to help them get by. I look at the title of this hearing, Ensuring Women Can Thrive in a Post-Pandemic Economy. Having suffered through, in Virginia, the strict shutdown requirements of a Democratic governor, I think the answer to ensuring women can thrive in a post-pandemic economy would be to stop electing Democratic governors. But I would say that now we have the higher gas prices that are putting pressure on women, on families, and the Biden administration and Washington Democrats are trying to put the blame on the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine that began just 3 weeks ago. Gas prices started rising 40% year over year before Russia's invasion. And so I would ask our witness, who is here, and I appreciate her being here in person, how do higher gas prices impact women, particularly mothers?
Oh, absolutely. It is such an obvious, sometimes we need to look at statistics and look at the data, but ask any mom, and she knows every time she fills up the tank. Back when President Biden was elected, it was about $2 a gallon, and a couple months ago, it was $3, and now it's well over $4. And this does impact every decision, and it's pushing up, it's helping fuel what's happening in our grocery stores and across our economy. And it's interesting because I do think that, I don't want to go off field here, but when we look at energy policy, this was another big driver of this. When we look at what's happened and what's happening in the world today, the decisions that were made to reduce energy production here in the United States is a big driver of that inflation, and it is rippling through our economy and hurting women.
It absolutely is. Over the past year, women's outerwear prices and dresses are up over 11%. Women's footwear and jewelry each up over 6%. Baby food up almost 8%. Baby clothing up almost 9%. After over a year of rising prices, Democrats are continuing to dismiss and downplay the impact of inflation on everyday goods, and often falsely blaming it on car and gasoline prices. You mentioned in your testimony that back in December of 2020, more than 70% of child care centers were open, while only about a third of public K-12 schools were fully in person. If the Democrats' proposed government-controlled child care policies and Build Back Better were in place 2 years ago, do you think government-run child care centers would have also shut down as public schools did?
Absolutely. And it's not just what happened with COVID. We talked about some of the problems that predated this pandemic. Well, certainly we've seen across the country, most recently in the city of Chicago, where there was a decision to close the schools and push everybody back to virtual learning. And I believe they just shut the doors for a while. And this is what happens when you have a system that really doesn't care whether or not how they serve those families, because it doesn't affect their budgets, it doesn't affect their livelihoods.
And as you said, the impact on women in the workforce of that type of situation would have been enormous. And so I'm glad that we avoided that. I do think we need to look at rolling back some of the red tape. It's largely going to have to be done in the states, because the states are aggressively over-regulating our child care centers, causing prices to go up. Democrats love to create a problem and then create a solution to the problem using aggressive government. And so here we go again with Democrats responsible for the rising price of childcare and now trying to cap it or in some way subsidize it with even more government intervention. So the policies of the majority party are often the problem, not the solution. And I would urge us to take a step back from that. So I appreciate the witnesses for being here, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have to respond to those last comments, because I think it's also very clear that what we have going on right now is pandemic profiteering by the largest corporations. The reality is, yes, families are dealing with sticker shock. And meantime, Mr. Chairman, profits for companies that put these goods on the shelves are skyrocketing. Data from the US Commerce Department shows that corporate profit margins are the largest they've been in 70 years. And even if you talk about energy costs, the reality is President Biden has called out that prices for unfinished gasoline were down by 5%, where the prices at the gas station went up by 3%. So in other words, companies are selling gas at the gas station, are increasing prices by more, or not handing down price decreases that they enjoyed just a few months back in November. So anyway, I just had to correct the record on exactly where these price increases are coming from. Now, that said, I want to talk about the subject at hand, which is the disparities among women in job numbers and industries that overwhelmingly employ women, like the domestic workforce. Normally, there are about 2.2 million domestic workers, and 91% are women. During the pandemic, domestic workers lost jobs even as their work became more essential for seniors and for others who needed to avoid care in congregate settings. And so I think it is absolutely essential that as we work to provide an inclusive and thriving economy, we have to ensure that domestic workers are included. Ms. Pooh, thank you for your work. I have argued with you in the past that our immigration system is sexclusionary, is what I call it, because it places value on work typically performed by men. Do you think that a similar systemic undervaluing of women's labor exists? And if so, can you talk about how it's hindering efforts to ensure that women are included in recovery efforts?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership. I think the entire debate on infrastructure is a really good example of the ways in which the contributions of women to the economy and how fundamental and essential they are is devalued in a systematic way. The fact that the definition of infrastructure is that which enables the economy and society to function. A bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed, and most of the jobs that were created in the context of the infrastructure bill will go to jobs that are predominantly held by men. There is another part of investment in infrastructure that we have yet to make, which is the investment in our caregiving systems and programs that will in an infrastructure where the jobs are largely held by women, as you just named, where we can actually turn these jobs into sustainable living wage jobs and ensure affordable, high quality access to care for the millions upon millions of working class families and working women in particular who rely on those programs. And so investing in, prioritizing, investing in our caregiving infrastructure, the way that we have invested in infrastructure, more traditional surface infrastructure, it is essential and fundamental. And the only reason why that I can see we don't see it in those terms is because we devalue the work of women. And it's really time in the 21st century that we address that. And this is an opportunity.
Let me follow up on that and just say that, we're trying to build back better. I think investing in protecting domestic workers gets at two issues: women who need the support of domestic workers to be able to do their own work outside the home, as well as the women who are doing very tough and often thankless work without the necessary support or basic rights. And you sort of referred to this. Why is supporting the domestic workforce crucial to ensuring that women can thrive in a post-pandemic economy?
Domestic workers as a workforce, more than 90% women, majority women of color, were disproportionately. This is work that is, by definition, work that has to be done in person. It is not remote work. And we have seen over and over again about how essential it is. Domestic workers were an essential lifeline throughout the pandemic to some of the people who are most vulnerable to COVID-19, older people, people with disabilities, people with chronic illnesses. Enabling this workforce to be secure, to have training, to have living wages, access to a safety net, rights and protections like the ones that are included in the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights that you have championed, means that we have a set of jobs for a workforce that is overwhelmingly women. And those jobs will enable many, many other jobs throughout the economy. They will enable all kinds of essential workers, professionals throughout the economy to go to work knowing that they have access to care and the services they need inside their homes.
The work that allows all other work to happen. And it's also why it's important that we keep those investments that we have proposed in Build Back Better for elder care, for child care, for all of this kind of work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing back.
Okay. Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, for 5 minutes. Please unmute, Ms. Plaskett.
Yes, so much for that. And I appreciate you holding this hearing. This is, of course, extremely important to me as a Black woman. And I'm really very grateful to your leadership in recognizing that this is a topic that all women, particularly women of color, are specifically feeling the impact of. I wanted to ask Ms. Pooh a question related to post-pandemic and labor market conditions of workers. Has the labor market changed in ways that affect women's ability to succeed in their works since the post-pandemic or the late stages of the pandemic? And do we have quantifiable evidence related to that? For example, are women better able to negotiate pay, working conditions, and scheduling with their employers now? Have we seen a change?
We are still early days in terms of collecting the data that we need, Congresswoman. Thank you for the question. But what I do know anecdotally from our membership is that the lack of access to childcare, to paid family and medical leave, to paid sick days, and to health care is still a huge, huge issue for workers. And the wages for domestic workers have not increased to better enable workers to afford the care that they need for their own families. So we are still hovering at about a 22% unemployment rate among domestic workers because the quality of the jobs is not good enough for workers to be able to work and take care of the people that they love and keep themselves safe. So we will continue to collect data. I'm not sure if Dr. Albanesi has more data as an economist, but from what I can tell is it's still a struggle. The American Rescue Plan investments did help. The child tax credit did help. And some of the emergency child care subsidies and emergency paid leave did help, which is why I really advocate for extending those. And it is still a struggle, and we need permanent investments in these jobs.
Well, I want to thank you for that. You know, I recognize, and statistically, We are all aware that women of color, of course, for the same jobs earn less pay, have additional constraints in the workplace that other women do not. And thus, there are long-term effects, even if they do find another job, that still impact them and their families. In general, do the effects of employment loss end when a worker finds a new job, or do we know the statistics on what happens to those families? The incremental changes and the incremental losses that happen to a family related to an initial job loss and that impact. And how can we, in our budget and as members of Congress, cushion American families or support them to rebound from this in the long term?
I think we've heard from Ms. Walker today about what happens when workers don't have the right supports, and she and her family are in debt as a result. And I think what we need to do is extend some of the investments that were made in the American Rescue Plan and invest in affordable, high-quality childcare, so people like Ms. Walker and our members at the National Domestic Workers Alliance can have those supports as they consider reentering the workforce.
Well, Ms. Walker has shown herself to be incredibly brave, and we are all grateful for her testimony. Dr. Albanesi, do you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yes, actually, I can add a couple of things. With respect to the programs that we've seen during the pandemic, including the child tax credit, one thing that economics teaches us is that for programs to change behavior of workers, they have to be sort of long-lived. So if the child credit is only in place for 6 months or 12 months, it may not be enough to change the behavior of a single mother who, is deciding whether to go back to the workforce and invest in a childcare arrangement or not. Instead, if a program is expected to last, for 2 or 3 years, that will actually change behavior. So, the predictability of these kinds of benefits is really useful so that workers can count on them and actually make appropriate choices.
Well, thank you so much for that information, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this really informative and important hearing.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. The gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of the witnesses for being here today. I want to start with you, Ms. Lukas. I want to talk about this government mandated childcare, and I want to first of all, it's funny. It seems like the majority party is always fond of declaring almost anything that they want to see happen a right, to justify it becoming something the government must guarantee. I know that this didn't evolve overnight, but it just baffles me as to how we ever reached this point where everything is a right. But anyway, now they've set their sights on government-run child and daycare. And look, I've got 6 grandchildren. The 2 youngest ones were born last year, and this is an issue that's very important to me. But I want to ask you, Ms. Lukas, what would happen if the majority party, the Democrats, got their way and mandated a government child care program?
Well, I am concerned that it would change the dynamic where instead of daycare and childcare providers being focused on providing for the family and serving the family, that they would be much more focused on serving regulators and on public policy officials. So it would operate more like the K through 12 public schools. And if I can, I would have a moment of caution because there's a lot of discussion about what an investment childcare is and how it leads to tremendous returns on investment. And yet nobody brings up Head Start, and that is the existing federal program which spends about $10,000 per child and serves thousands of children. And there have been congressionally mandated studies to see, is this investment paying off in terms of lasting school readiness? Do you see gains? And any gains that these congressionally mandated studies have shown that any benefits fade out over time. The programs that people point to show this tremendous return on investment are small programs and that served extremely disadvantaged communities communities. In fact, there was just a study done of a program in Tennessee that they were hopeful that they were going to see some real returns on this. And in fact, they found again that not only did it not have positive effects, that it was actually associated with negative effects. And I'll be sure to pass this on so that the information on that study is available to everyone here, because I think it is very telling and cautionary. It doesn't mean that preschool can never be good or daycare can never yield investments, but we should be rather humble about knowing that government programs are going to provide this return on investment.
Well, thank you for that input, and we look forward to getting that information from you. You know, I've been going through this. I haven't been going through it, but my sons and their families have been going through the process of going to different daycare centers and seeing the very diversity of them and making a decision based on, hey, we like this, we like that, and this is what we want to try to get. How do you think the curriculum would be changed if we had government mandated daycare centers, Ms. Lukas? And could working parents maintain flexibilities, do you think, with private child care centers?
You know, I would be very concerned that, especially when it comes to right now, currently about 50% of child care are faith-based. And I think those would have a lot of trouble with mandates made by state governments, that those would be kind of pushed out of the marketplace. And I do think we would see a lot like K through 12 schools. It would become much more cookie cutter. You know, we have seen over the past several decades a steep decline in at-home child care, which is something the parents really want. There was almost 50%, I believe it was a 50% decline between 2005 and 2016 in the number of at-home daycare providers. We need to take a hard look at the regulations that are making it impossible for those small businesses to stay in business, because there is a lot of regulatory overreach, and we would have a greater diversity if we were able to remove that red tape.
So you would agree that it's important to have a diversity of institutions to serve parents and their kids. You know, I mean, I'm so relieved to hear you say this, because this is such a big decision for parents. My daughter-in-law is Catholic. My son is Methodist and a Protestant, and you know, they're interviewing all these different daycare centers and putting such thought and so much time into making these kind of decisions, and it's really such a fascinating thing to watch in this. And my fear is that that's going to go away, and that we're just going to have cookie cutter child care centers anymore. Any comment on that, Ms. Lukas?
I do worry about that. And I'll just have one more really quick. I know that the time's almost up, but you should look at the mask policies, because I think one of the things that's a tremendous tragedy is how we have kept our youngest children masked. Everybody here has the freedom to take off their masks, yet the kids sitting in Head Start are still forced to wear masks, even though it's impeding their learning development, impeding their speech. I think it's terrible, and I'm terribly concerned about that being the wave of the future if the Build Back Better child care program went into effect.
Thank you, Ms. Lukas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Next in line is Ms. Jackson Lee, but her camera is not on. If you are there, Ms. Jackson Lee, okay, you are there. Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a crucial meeting. Obviously, there's much going on. Let me ask also the doctor, but let me make this point as I appreciate the witness who indicated that there would be a problem with trying to provide a 7% top of how much families, women, would pay for childcare. And because women's salaries, sometimes heads of households, are lower than men, if you will, even as heads of households, I'm stunned that this would not be a positive. Clearly, good childcare would not be spending their time focusing on government regulations. They'd be spending their time being grateful of the quality of childcare that would generate by securing federal funding. And the amount of people maximized beyond Head Start. Head Start is a governmental program. Childcare is not a governmental program. Childcare is giving people access to childcare wherever they are. So, Ms. Poole, let me ask you this question. What kind of seismic change would come about. For example, if you invested through, say, the Build Back Better Act in lowering childcare costs so that women could reimagine their lives through new training, education, longer hour jobs, how would that improve the economic condition of children and women? And then additionally, could you find anything negative to having provisions that would increase the opportunity for childcare and lower the cost? My third question is, you may not be a Head Start expert, but I'm not really seeing those numbers. I guess I'll have to explore that to say that their impact fades out. Well, you want the impact to be as they leave Head Start and go into elementary school, and then they're left in the hands of good teachers, and hopefully they'll move on with that foundation. But Ms. Poole, can you answer my first question, please? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the questions, Congresswoman. I think that making childcare more affordable would be nothing short of transformative in the lives of women. And right now, women are spending between 9 and 40% of their income on childcare. And so not having to spend more than 7% of their incomes means that there's more income to pay for nutritious food, to pay for for a rainy day, to pay off the debts like the ones that Ms. Walker has accumulated. It would be nothing short of transformative for women and their entire families, and for the ability to transfer generational wealth, to create economic mobility so that one generation can do better than the next. I think there's so many ripple effects that we will see, beginning from having less pressure on your pocketbook, which is something that is absolutely essential in the short term to achieve. The cost of childcare is one of the most significant fixed costs for families right now. If we want to lower costs for families, making childcare affordable is the way to do it. And I've never heard any data that the impact of Head Start fades over time. In fact, I've heard the opposite. And I've encountered so many people across professions who have benefited from the Head Start program that has allowed them to actually have an equal footing as they enter public school.
Well, thank you for that. Let me conclude my remarks. First of all, Mr. Chairman, this was a long overdue and very vital hearing to focus on women. There are several elements of the Build Back Better Act. We contributed to its construction. I think the Budget Committee did an excellent job. But to make the care economy real, women who care for people, make it a profession, increase the salaries of the women who had to stay out of the workplace, but they could come back to the workplace with a professional, skilled industry of care workers. I believe that that combination, childcare, will put women on a sure footing, no matter what their educational level is and what level of job they have. There are many women bosses who need childcare as well, and there are many women who work day to day, hour to hour, that need childcare. And so I hope we can move this forward. Thank you very much. Ms. Poole, thank you for your testimony and also for the witnesses. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra, for 5 minutes.
Hey, thank you, Chairman Yarmuth and Ranking Member Smith. I want to thank each one of our witnesses for their testimony today. And I share your concerns that we need our kids to have a great education, and our economy recovery cannot exclude women who are trying to find work. You know, one of the toughest problems facing my constituents in Iowa is the lack of childcare. And we just talked about this. I hear question after question about childcare. So it's great that we're talking about this topic. There's a lot of work being done in this space with our Iowa governor working to find solutions to ensure that moms aren't forced to stay home. However, one of the key drivers of this problem in my state is a lack of workforce. And that hasn't been talked about a lot today, right? We have a lack of workforce. We have a lack of staff for our childcare. Our unemployment in Iowa is at 3.7%, and for women, it's 2.8%. That's because Iowans avoided some of the pitfalls that a lot of other states had when they recovered from this pandemic. You know what? For Iowa, we kept our schools open to ensure that our kids are getting a great education. And our parents weren't forced to struggle between feeding their family and keeping their kids on track, right? Our schools were open. Studies agree with this, and the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis found that nearly 70% of mothers in states that shuttered schools were forced out of work compared to mothers living in states that kept schools open. Isn't that amazing? You know, the states that shuttered all of a sudden had this massive problem, but the states that didn't don't have this problem. Second, Iowa didn't double or triple down on its harmful lockdown policies after medicines became available. You know, we went mask free. We just heard earlier how important that was for kids. The rising crisis that is starting to crush moms across this country is inflation. Just yesterday, it was announced that the wholesale inflation rose by 10% over last year. Gas up 40%. Heating your home is up 15%. Expense after expense on that bottom line for families. Flooding the country with trillions of spending is making American lives worse. A budget committee, we showed actively accounting for the trillions we have printed to recommend recessions of unspent funds. And this is just, again, another hidden tax, this inflationary cost because of all this money we dumped in the system. Ms. Lukas, you've talked a lot about this already, and I appreciate all your comments. But do you have any thoughts or ideas when it comes to childcare and workforce and how we can help the workforce out? To me, the bottom line for us in Iowa is the childcare industry just simply needs workforce. What is your thoughts on that?
You know, I do think that it's important to talk about kind of those supply side effects when it comes to labor. And there's an interesting study, I think, the Heritage Foundation's Rachel Getzler wrote a piece that looked at some of this, and she notes that states that ended the unemployment insurance bonuses in July 2021 or earlier experienced a significantly greater pace of employment recovery in July and August than the states that hadn't. And she estimates that if the economy of all the states had ended those unemployment bonuses earlier, we would have had 800,000 more jobs gained in July and August. I do think it's important. We've talked a lot about the need. Everybody supports helping people. We want there to be a robust safety net. But we need to make sure that that safety net is a safety net, not one that impedes people from returning to work. Because as some of my fellow witnesses have talked about, we need people in the childcare industry, that it is these jobs create jobs, and we need to make sure that the incentives are right so that we're not discouraging labor force participation permanently.
Yeah, thanks, Mrs. Lukas. I greatly appreciate those comments. And you said something very valuable, you know, and this is very seldom gets talked about. But if you're a family like me, I have a family of four, I got 4 children. When you're doing your monthly budget and all these items are drastically going up, it really limits what you can do. And it really pinches daycare because you just don't have the dollars to do it. Now, you can throw more dollars in. That's very, very temporary. And obviously what we've seen is that just created more inflation. It creates higher cost of product. So it's just, to me, being in economics, this is not the way we do things. I mean, it's just wrong on so many levels. So with that, I yield back and thank you again for each one of your testimonies.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing really should be called How Recent Government Policies Have Hurt Americans, Women Included, because it's hurt women just as much as every other American to have our most basic freedoms that we couldn't have imagined being under assault and under attack even just 2 or 3 years ago from what we've seen in the last couple of years. But our most basic freedoms, like our freedom of movement, our freedom to travel. Even today, we don't have true freedom to travel without wearing a mask. Our freedom of assembly, getting together. Heck, even in this room, we don't have everybody in the hearing room. They're doing it by Zoom. This Congress votes by proxy. We continue to use the China virus as an excuse to have these emergency provisions, which we all know are not necessary. Our most basic freedom just to earn a living, to operate our business, to go to work, to keep our job. Our freedom to worship, and our freedom to educate our children or have our children go to school and to be there in person. These have been trampled upon and harmed our children, harmed our families, harmed mothers, harmed women in general. History will judge us harshly by how we've sacrificed our children on the altar of politics over these last 2 years. you touched on it just a few moments ago, but the fact that we would close schools for children who are at almost no risk to the virus, for 2 years, kids are at home or trying to learn remotely when they're at almost no risk to the virus. We've treated everybody the same. We've treated children like senior citizens. We've treated college students like those with multiple comorbidity factors. How do we ever make up for these mothers, these women's children? How do we ever make up the lost learning for 2 years? So they graduate, what, with just 2 years less of school? Not to mention the developmental delay, the social delay, the emotional issues that have come in there. In my home county, we lifted the mask mandate, thankfully, finally. It should have never been in place. It's child abuse, to put a child in a mask all day long when we know masks don't make any difference. That's why no one who's been enforcing it all this time ever wears it when no one's looking. It's virtue signaling. I saw a doctor on CNN say, hey, it just shows what team you're on. It's virtue signaling. It just sends a message that you care when you wear your mask. But to do that to children all day long when they're almost no risk for the virus, and also we know from studies that masks don't make any difference. But in my home county of Campbell County outside Lynchburg in the 5th District of Virginia, half the kids are still wearing masks when they don't have to. Why? Because we've told them they're going to die from the virus. And they've gotten comfortable with this thing on their face. In the meantime, for women across this country, these policies that have made them less secure with the border invasion that we have not just allowed to happen, we've caused to happen by this government's policies, our weakness on the national stage, where as we look across the ocean to Ukraine, what's happening there, or the threat of China, the threat of North Korea, the threat of Iran, and the American weakness that's been projected, the massive spending that's robbing women, Americans and families of their purchasing power, costing them thousands of dollars a year more now than it did previously, last year, just to buy the essentials. Grocery prices through the roof, gas prices through the roof, as we've declared war on American energy. These policies are harmful to women. The crime explosion in this country, undermining our police. Not to mention, we have fired women for not getting vaccines, not allowed them to keep their job as essential healthcare workers, not allowed them to stay in the military, not allowed them to stay in law enforcement, not allowed them to provide for the family, because we've taken away their right, again, trampled on their right to their most basic freedom of their own health decisions, and then we fired them if they didn't do what their government wanted them to do. So I know you're chomping at the bit to respond, Ms. Lukas. I'll let you just respond to any additional thoughts you might have.
I appreciate that. And I do think when we look at the decisions we've made about our children, it contrasts very much with the rest of the world. When you look at, we've talked a little bit about European systems and what they do to support families. Well, one thing they didn't do was to put little kids in masks. Even the WHO had said that masking children under age 5 was not recommended, was bad. It was not just not recommended, but was harmful. And through most of Europe, they have long had something where a policy that children under the age of 11 or 12 do not wear masks. I do think that we're going to see tremendous mental health impacts from this. We see now there was a 51% in girls, teenage girls, attempted suicides during these last 2 years, and this is something we're going to be living with, damaging effects for a really long time.
And we're not telling the truth about the risk of the virus, which I heard Dr. Ben Carson say was the most dangerous virus in the most dangerous. We're not telling the truth about the risk of the vaccine, which I heard Dr. Ben Carson say is the most dangerous vaccine in history, and we're forcing it upon children who had almost no risk for the virus. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes.
Well, first of all, Ms. Lukas, I'd like to thank you for being here. You know, I know most of the people back home in Wisconsin, where I'm from, they go to work in the day and they make it do. And I'm sure it would have been easier for you to just call it in and do this from your kitchen table. But I think, you know, you really can tell a lot more or learn about a lot more when somebody's here and in person. So I'd like to thank you for understanding that and being here. Couple comments here. During this pandemic, a lot of people were mandated vaccine-wise. And I certainly got calls from many nurses. I have such a high opinion of nurses. I thought it was so offensive and un-American to force them to get the vaccine. I know a lot of nurses who quit, particularly if they were concerned it might have an effect on a pregnancy down the line. I met with a doctor earlier today. He was concerned about that. And I could just envision a bunch of guys sitting around at NIH or CDC or whatever saying, well, everybody can have the vaccine. Do you think the fear of a negative effect on the vaccine is something that, particularly because so many of them work in the healthcare field, disproportionately hurt women?
Well, certainly when it comes to fertility issues, that was something that I know a lot of women personally were very concerned with, because this is, you can be somebody who supports the concept of a vaccine and wants people to get vaccinated, but when it comes to our kids and our fertility, there's a lot of questions, and so we need to let free people make their decisions.
Right, and when I go through a hospital, I certainly see more women working there than men overall,
Sure.
and I wondered if there wasn't a little bit of tacit sexism going on there when they cracked down and told everybody who works in the hospital, but women in particularly, that they would have to lose their jobs if they didn't get a vaccine. I was very offended, but I just wondered if you had any other comments on that.
Well, I think that, again, we've learned a lot during the course of this pandemic, and one of the things we've really learned in the last several months in the wake of Omicron is that the vaccine's protection is for you personally, and it has not been preventing the spread of the disease, which makes it all the more, I think, inappropriate to force people to not have the opportunity to work and support themselves merely because they make a different health choice and weigh their own risks differently than the government does.
We have all sorts of statistics before us today. Do you know any general statistics as far as percentage-wise women and percentage of men who want to stay out of the workforce and take care of their kids?
I think that it's actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think we've talked a little bit and heard some about the wage gap, and it was actually a holiday the other day called Equal Pay Day that is often used as a proxy to talk about how much women are underpaid systemically. And the truth is that a lot of women, a lot of that is not discrimination, but is because women often do decide to prioritize things other than earning and want to stay home with their kids, and we should respect that. That's why I think it's important for any support that's given to families when people with young kids isn't made conditional on hiring somebody else to care for your kids. We should be providing support and recognizing the value of people who do choose to stay home.
Why do you think some people dislike women? I mean, I think it's fine. When I grew up, my mom was at home more often than not. Why do you think there's this dislike for women who are staying at home with their kids?
It's funny. I think that sometimes there's this almost like, I think, a myth of the mommy wars, that I think when you talk to actual women, that, I'm a working mom and I know some stay-at-home moms, and they are fully staying-at-home moms, and they're the people who bail me out when I can't get there to pick up my kids, and they are the ones who help so much in the classrooms, and I think there's a lot more respect. I fear from a public policy standpoint, sometimes there is a lack of respect, but I do think it comes from elites, that it's not on the ground moms, because I think on the ground moms respect the decisions that other women make.
And if a stay-at-home mom, say she decides to work part-time or not work overtime or whatever, that winds up statistically look like that there's something wrong with our society, right? I mean, if some woman's taking the professional track and some woman professional but maybe working 20 hours a week, or when that runs through the statistics, they claim that there's something wrong with our society for allowing women to stay at home or allowing women to work part-time. Do you think that means there's something wrong with our society?
No, I think that in my old women's studies classes, they would have talked about this conversation as having a really male lens, just judging everyone by how much money they earn, where a lot of women focus on other things, and including they value the time they get to spend with their kids.
Yeah, I think people who just look solely at money are shallow, and I've always felt that way. Okay, well, again, thank you for being here today. It was very nice for you to come on down and talk to us in person.
Yeah. Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is good to be back. I love how Congress schedules all committee hearings all at the same time. Such a use of efficiency here in the nation's capital. I'm quite sure everybody watching C-SPAN right now hears all my sarcasm. I just want to jump into it. Obviously, we have a limited amount of time. First of all, look, the American Rescue Plan, when it was written so fast after the president was inaugurated, it was an excuse, in my view, to essentially unleash long-held policy ideals from people on the political left that they've wanted to accomplish for quite some time. And so the pandemic was the crisis not being let go to waste. It was pretty clear from economists all across the spectrum that if we actually passed that piece of legislation, and we talked about it here in the Budget Committee, that if we passed that piece of legislation, it would lead to inflationary pressures in the United States. Obviously, Larry Summers' comments have been proven to be very accurate. His comments today about a potential Federal Reserve interest rate hike is that if the Federal Reserve does not do this quickly in an appropriate manner, we are going to enter a period of stagflation in the United States. And so the point I want to really bring us home for the witnesses here, and I'm going to ask you guys about this stuff, is, Ms. Poe, I want to make sure I pronounce your last name correctly, but I know that, you and your organization have advocated for, I'm assuming, permanency in the child tax credit. But my question for you is, even if you have permanency in the child tax credit, but the United States enters a period of stagflation where inflationary pressures continue to be high, don't these families that receive this advancement of a tax credit, isn't the purchasing power of the dollars they receive already going to be eroded from higher inflation rates in the United States, which come from passage of this policy to begin with? And many others, by the way.
I think actually Dr. Albanesi is probably in a better position to answer questions about how inflation works long term. But what I will say is that we are paying for care, specifically, which is my area of expertise, in incredibly costly, inefficient, and ineffective ways.
Well, I'll get, because I only got 2 minutes, so we're gonna have to plug and play here. And I apologize. I wish we did this differently, where we weren't tied to 5-minute segments, but I don't set the rules. My point is that, listen, I get it. Listen, I had 3 kids. I pay childcare. I know what it is. It is a car payment. Sometimes it's a Mercedes payment, depending on where you live and what you're doing. Been there, done it. I got the checks. I've written the checks. I know what I'm talking about. I know you do as well. My point is that when you interject with massive amounts of governmental spending, specifically to childcare, and you're chasing childcare, what actually ends up happening is the cost of childcare will actually increase as a result of additional federal stimulus. Look no further than the university system in the United States. We essentially subsidize federal student loans because we think it's in the best interest of students. But what it also does, it allows universities and colleges to raise their tuition rates because they know that there is essentially a pot of unlimited dollars chasing university slots and being able to pay tuitions, which, the good doctor, obviously, through her work, sees on a day-to-day basis, and that's also spiraled into a student loan crisis. I guess, look, at the end of the day, and Dr. Albanesi, that's correct?
Albanesi, yes.
Albanesi, you said earlier that with respect to people coming out of the workforce, there was really a differentiation between college graduates and non-college graduates. In your studies, was it college versus non-college? And amongst the college segment, was there a differentiation between men and women? Because you didn't say that in that answer. I just want to expound upon that. Is a differentiation between in the non-college graduates, men versus women, versus college graduates, men and women, or really is there no differentiation at all with respect to academic attainment?
No, there is some differentiation. So most of the decline in participation of women is coming from women without a college degree, but there was a slight decline also for women with a college degree, but it was temporary and very short-lived. And as I mentioned earlier in response to another question, where we saw the decline in participation was not, again, women quitting their job, but women becoming unemployed and then deciding that, they weren't going to search for a new job, perhaps because of childcare challenges or other issues, including not having sufficient protection from infection in a care job where they were very exposed.
I appreciate your answer. I really, really do. I'm already out of time. I'm abusing the chairman's time right now. Only thing I would add to your point is, yes, it goes without question that there are many people who are out of the workforce because we literally shut down the economy in the United States. And I would argue, especially if you are the woman in the household and you're in an industry that Ms. Poe represents, you were first on the chopping block because you're service oriented. And if people are basically locked in their houses, then those service jobs are no longer needed. So I don't really think that it's appropriate to say that that's about men versus women. That's much more appropriate to say that it's about governmental policy and how you shut down an economy. And it actually had the most impacts on women as a result of the policy decisions that were made in shutting down an economy, which is why we shouldn't be shutting down economies. But I digress, and I yield back.
Okay, gentleman's time has expired, and I will remind the gentleman that he has the right to submit any questions to the witnesses that he didn't get to for the record. And you've submitted them within a week. And we would do it. I now yield myself 10 minutes. And I love going last because I get to push back against a lot of things, but also I'm going to start in an uncharacteristic way, and I'm going to agree with my Republican colleagues on two things. One is we do need to provide much better oversight over everything the government does. That's been one of my biggest complaints since I've been here, and now that I'm on my way out, I will repeat it. We don't spend nearly enough time dealing with the impact and the effectiveness of the actions we take. Been true before the American Rescue Plan, and I will remind everyone that the American Rescue Plan really has not been in effect for a year yet. So the question is, when do you make when do you conduct that oversight? And I'm not sure we're actually ready to do that because a lot of decisions are still being made as to how that money is spent. The second thing I will agree with some of the comments my colleagues has been the question of the supply side aspect of things like child care. I stressed this over and over with the administration as we were developing the American Rescue Plan, that we have to focus as much on building capacity as we do on helping our citizens afford the service. Because if we don't create capacity, and that's true of early childhood education, it's true of senior care, regardless of what it is, that all we're doing is providing much more money to chase not an increased number of opportunities, and that will necessarily lead to inflation. So that said, I'm finished agreeing with my Republican colleagues, and I want to push back on a few things. One is, I know that the ranking member talks a lot about how only 9% of the American Rescue Plan was spent on actual COVID treatment and combating COVID. But virtually all of the American Rescue Plan was designed to deal with the impact of COVID. And for instance, $122 billion to help schools reopen, which we all want to do, which is a high priority of Republicans and Democrats, $122 billion to make sure that schools can reopen safely and effectively. And part of that $122 billion was for remedial education, which many of the schools are now trying to figure out how to do. So, the biggest complaint I get now from some of my citizens is they're trying to get one program or another financed through the American Rescue Plan, and the government is telling them, no, that's not COVID related. So I would take issue with the characterization, although with the way you've expressed it, you're technically correct. Now I want to talk about inflation and gas prices. Everybody has an idea of what causes inflation, and the American Rescue Plan is an easy target, although on the one hand you say so much of the American Rescue Plan hasn't been spent yet, and then you blame it for creating inflation. You got to have it one way or the other. But I know I love the way Mr. Donald said, economists across the spectrum believe this, but the only economist who's been mentioned today taking issue with the American Rescue Plan and inflation has been Lawrence Summers. And so I would look to cite some other economists like Moody's Analytics, which said, now this is a few weeks ago, this is prior to whatever has happened to gas prices. I will qualify that. But as of a few weeks ago, Moody's Analytics said that the American Rescue Plan was responsible for less than 1% of the inflation we're experiencing, something like 0.6%. And the Fed in San Francisco did a similar study and came up with the same answer. So Mr. Smucker wanted to have a hearing on the causes of inflation. I think it would be very instructive to do that because I think you'd find a lot of different answers and a lot of different opinions as to what's responsible for how much of the inflation. Again, we've talked a lot about Republican governors and Democratic governors, and Mr. Dogg had talked about his opinion of the Texas governor. I have a great governor. He's a Democratic governor. The state legislature is 75% Republican. So, it's kind of hard to call Kentucky a red state, a blue state by any stretch of the imagination, although our Kentucky governor has done a great job. And when you contrast it, not with some of the metrics that have been mentioned here today, but with the issue of number of cases per capita, number of cases overall, percentage of hospitalizations, number of deaths, I think you would find that the states that have done the worst in terms of preventing damage, health consequences to their citizens, they've been Republican-led states, and not Democratic-led states. Finally, I want to talk about gas prices. You talked about gas prices and suggested, Mrs. Lukas, some of the things we ought to do. Do you know how many barrels of oil the United States is producing today?
I don't.
Okay, it's over 12 million barrels a day. Do you know where that ranks among all the countries in the world?
No,
Number one. We produce more oil on a daily basis right now than Russia, than Saudi Arabia, and every other country. And so to say that somehow the policies that apparently Joe Biden has put in place over the last 13 and a half months that he's been in office have done damage to our production of energy is not borne out by the facts. And in fact, we're producing more oil now than we ever did under Donald Trump, than we ever have done under any other president, Republican or Democrat. And in addition, there are 9 million acres of licensed drilling opportunities in the United States right now. And I don't think that any Republican or Mrs. Lukas would want us to have a Gazprom, a government-sponsored oil company, doing the drilling. We have private enterprise in this country. They make the decisions as to when to drill, when it is in their economic interest to drill and to produce oil. They're doing that right now. I don't necessarily blame. I think, there's been a current spike that's actually receded because of the invasion of Ukraine, but I don't think it, I don't call it Putin's inflation of oil prices. That's an international market which we don't control, but we're doing our best to accommodate. I want to thank Ms. Walker for her very compelling story, and I know that is a story that is true of many, many women throughout the country. And I do want to make one comment, and that is, because it's important that everybody realizes this, you may or may not know, but the child tax credit expansion has not ended. The monthly checks have ended. There are 6 months more of child tax credit expansion this year. You have to file a tax return to get it. But the same criteria, you don't have to make money, you just have to, you don't have to have an income or taxable income, you just have to file the return. And speaking to the CBO director last week, there was a very encouraging sign that he said only about 6%, he thought right now is the estimate of those who are eligible have not taken advantage of that. So I want to make sure that people, if they haven't, do take advantage of it. In the remaining time, I do want to ask a question of Dr. Albanesi. You mentioned the child penalty that was up to 40%. Could you explain a little bit about how what's in that 40%? How do you get to that 40%?
It's how much women's wages drop 3 years or more after having their first child as a result of having become mothers. And it's 40%, as I said, and it contributes to the largest fraction of the gender wage gap overall. And it is a combination of both career choices, labor supply, and also forced career choices that women make, as well as outright discrimination discrimination in some types of occupations. But it's why, for in most, households, mothers tend to be the lower earning, member of the household, two-earner couple. And it's also why, single mothers, have more trouble making ends meet compared to maybe single fathers because they are paid less. So it is, a substantial. The United States is not the only country where this exists. Unfortunately, it's very common amongst comparable countries, though it varies quite a bit across countries depending on, the wage structure and so on.
Great. One final comment before I close, and that is my daughter-in-law is in the child care business. She has a daycare center with her mother and grandmother. They run it. And one of the things that Kentucky did with the ARP money was to set up a fund to help support child care. And what that has enabled my daughter-in-law's business to do is actually to compete on salary with other businesses, and she's now able to pay them a competitive wage. She's having a much easier time, although I wouldn't characterize it easy. She's having a less difficult time finding qualified personnel to work in the daycare center, and so that's been a positive way that the American Rescue Plan has helped support childcare, again, going through Kentucky government. So with that, I only went 17 seconds over my time, and I was very lenient with the other side, and I'm not going to let everybody go and get lunch, but I want to once again thank all of our witnesses. I will take issue with the one comment that we learn more from a witness. Mr. Grothman said we learn more from a witness in the room than we do from virtually. I wouldn't say that's necessarily true. It would be nice to have all the witnesses in the room. I agree it does create a better dialogue, but I think we've learned a lot from our virtual witnesses as well. So if there's no further business, I thank the witnesses for their testimony and responses, and this meeting, without objection, is adjourned.